Hi, my name is Elliot Gable. I'm the author of Survival Ascension, an upcoming open world survival MMO. I'm here to talk to you today about Microsplat. It is a terrain texturing asset for Unity. It's something that I use in the game. Before we get started, I would recommend that you view this video in 4K resolution on a large screen TV. Be easier to read all the text and see everything that's on screen. So what we're looking at here on the screen is Unity with the scene view up top and the 3D view down below. The 3D view is currently showing the character starting camera. This is just a slice of part of the terrain that's inside Survival Ascension. And the texturing here is all being done by Microsplat. You can see that there's a lot of texture mixing going on here. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how you use Microsplat to achieve this type of effect. So if you look up here in the scene view, you can see that normal textures, when they're applied right next to each other, they have this tiling pattern that's easily visible in the texture. And that's something that distracts from the gameplay. It's highly noticeable from a distance, especially if you have things in your game that fly. There will be birds and other items and devices and animals in Survival Ascension that will allow you to fly over the textured terrain, and we don't want this type of tiling to be visible, so we want to remove those types of artifacts. And that's where Microsplat is extremely handy for doing procedural texturing. So on the right-hand side here, you can see the configuration for the Microsplat shader that's applied to the terrain. It has a lot of different options, but the one we're focusing on today is this procedural texturing option. That's what is actually generating all of the textures here on the terrain. Now, when you first get Microsplat set up, it starts out with a single curve to represent how the texture is applied to the terrain. And you can click on that and you can try to sort of adjust how that texture is applied. In this case, we're looking at this darker sand texture, and the left-hand side here represents a height of 0, which would be the ocean floor here in Survival Ascension, the way the map is set up. And right here, about 25% into the width of this curve, that would represent roughly where the top of the ocean is, and so that would be where the ocean intersects with the terrain itself. And that's basically right here where this sand line is forming around the grass areas. So trying to represent where that ocean hits the terrain in a single curve is rather tricky to do. I've kind of outlined it here. You put, a high weight down here where you're under the water on this sand texture. You want that sand texture to be prominent, so you give it a high weight down here under the water. But then when you get to right where the water meets up with the terrain, you want that sand to really quickly fall off so that the grass textures and dirt textures can take over. And so that's what this huge drop is here in weight on this texture. And then as you move towards the right, you get up closer towards the top of the elevation in the map. The highest point in the map is just over 4,000 meters high, and there's also several hundred meters that you can fly above that point. So this point on the right represents basically 5,000 meters, and so the weight needs to drop off here, and you can do that just by dragging this point down. And this will approximate what I want the texture to do as the elevation increases across the map. However, that's a little tricky to set up. So I've done some work in the past couple of days to enhance the Microsplat terrain texturing capabilities, and I've added this multi-curve feature in there. So when you check this multi-curve feature, what it does is it gives you multiple different curves that you can set up, which represent segments of elevation. So here I have it set up with 3 segments of elevation. So this top curve, the left-hand side of it represents 0 meters. That's, again, the bottom of the seafloor. And then the right-hand side represents right where the ocean meets the terrain at 1,250 meters. That's the depth of the ocean. And if I click on that graph, you can see that I've got a straight line applied here, which is basically a weight of 0.5, so 50%, applied to every height from the seafloor up to where the ocean meets the terrain. Then the next segment starts at where the previous one ended. So this second one is going to start at 1,250 meters, and it's going to go up to 2,000 meters. And this one drops the weight of the sand texture down to just 10%, or 0.1. And then it continues to fall off as it approaches that 2,000 meter mark. Then the final segment here, it's starting at 2,000 meters at a weight of 0, and it continues all the way to 5,000 meters at a weight of 0. So this lets me exclude this sand texture from generating in those elevation ranges. Then I also have a slope adjustment on how I weight for that terrain. So I have a high, strong weight on that particular texture when I'm flat. So this would be 0 slope. So we'd be perfectly flat here. And so we have the highest weight on the sand texture when we're perfectly flat. As we approach a slope of 35%, that would be, it's actually 35% of 90 degrees. So 90 degrees is completely vertical. That's what the 1.0 over here represents, is 90 degrees. And so we're at 35% of that. So it's going to be roughly 33 degrees. And so at 33 degrees, we're down to a 10% weight on that sand texture. And then we continue to fall off as it gets steeper until we're down to 0 at 90 degrees. Now, to get rid of the tiling effect, the way that we achieve that is we use noise, and we use multiple textures. You can see I have several different sand textures here that are all starting or ending at the 1,250 meters or around there. I want a slightly different ending position for some of them because of the way I want the beach to look. But then you'll see I have noise turned on each of these. And the noise is what allows you to break up the texture repetitive patterns here. So you can see the noise applied here in this section of the terrain. And you can see when you change this noise, it can dramatically alter the way that terrain renders. And if you drop this noise down far enough, it gets really big for the frequency, because you're basically, it's sort of like a wave function where you have peaks and troughs. At a higher frequency, those peaks are closer together, and at a lower frequency, they're spread further apart. So by increasing the frequency, you can create more and more detailed texturing, randomized texturing, by mixing the different textures together. Now, the other thing to keep in mind here is this offset. If you have the same offset on 2 textures that are blended together with this random noise, then they're going to generate the exact same noise patterns, and they'll cancel each other out. So you can see I put this offset to the same as the other one, and all of the noise, they just canceled each other out on the 2 textures. So in order for the noise to work, offset the noise slightly, the noise functions for each texture that you want, so that the functions don't cancel each other out. And that's what lets us get this complex pattern. Now you can see I have some other sand textures blended in here as well. And those are controlled by these other textures. So if I set that to 128, that's changed that texture a bit. Now I can make that more prominent by adjusting these sliders, and you can see them. This one is designed to apply mostly on slopes, so you can see it appearing up there on these slopes because that's where it's applied. So we can leave it right here, and we'll get some windswept sand on the slopes of the grass here. Now we want to take a look here at this grass. We still have a lot of patterning on this grass that's very artificial looking. So we want to try to break up that patterning. And so I've got some demonstration here of the grass frequencies. Now you can see this bright green splotch here on the darker green. The darker green is from this texture here, this number 3 texture. And then the bright splotch is number 4 texture. And the reason that this splotch is so large is because the frequency of the noise is so low. If we increase that frequency of the noise, you'll see all those big green splotches turned into little green splotches. And again, on this darker green texture, again, our frequency is really low at 1. And so it's just this gigantic splotch over the whole terrain. So we can turn that up. And then we have another texture here that also plays into that, which we want to turn up. And then the other point here is this min and max value, which is what range we're generating the noise in. So that applies a modifier to the weight curve. So if we look at our weight curve here, and we see that it's 0.5 from the left-hand side all the way to the right-hand side, and you look at this noise function, you can see we're generating from negative 0.5 to 1. So as it travels across the terrain, it's going to continuously modify the weight value here up and down as that noise is applied. And so it's simply going to do an additive modification. So with a minimum value of negative 0.5, some of these locations will randomly come down to 0. And with a max of 1, some of them will go up to 1.5. Now you can have up to a maximum of 4 for blending effects, but I usually try to stay within 0 to 1 for all the textures. So I'm going to remove this, put it as a 0.5. And then you'll see this one, we don't have the min-max set correctly on it either. So if we change that to negative 0.5, you can now see that it's no longer overriding all the other textures because of its extra high weight that it had. And then we can reduce this down to the 0.5 as well. And now you can see that all 3 of these textures are blending in there on the main terrain area. Plus, we're getting a little bit of extra blending from the windswept sand texture that's coming in here on the slopes as well. And that really breaks up the texturing and the artificial looking patterns that you can see. And you can still see them up close here. So we probably want to break that up a little more. So this stripe pattern that's on there is very easy to spot. And so we may want to look at doing some additional breaking up of that pattern. Now you don't have to use powers of 2 here, but it's easier to do the math in your head and kind of get the same repeatable patterning if you know your powers of 2 and can adjust them accordingly. So now you see we're really breaking up that striped pattern that's on there. And so we can keep tweaking this further, and we can even pick out additional textures to just blend into this ground pattern, and we can break that up further with other textures. And we can also play with the weight of the texture as well. So for example, we may just want to just drop some of the weight on this texture, and as we drop the weight on this texture, we should start seeing it dissipate. So now that line pattern is really disappearing. So we just want to play with this until we get the exact look that we're going for on that particular area of the terrain. But now you can see we're getting kind of these patterns coming in on this other texture that's got really noticeable patterns in it. And so we can play with weights on that as well, and we can further break things up or mix in additional textures as we want. But that's just a brief demo of how to use Microsplat terrain procedural textures and how to break up the different patterns. The one other thing I wanted to mention is UV values for these textures. Now, not all of your textures are going to be the same size, and so you need to get all of your textures scaled to the right uniform scale based on how they were taken or created from source. So for example, if there were photos that were 1 meter by 1 meter or 2 meters by 2 meters, you would have a uniform scale if all of them were that way, but some of them might represent a 3.5 by 3.5 meter scale, or they might be a 10 meter by 10 meter image that represents your texture. And so you have to adjust your UV scales to make sure that they map correctly to your terrain so that they look right when you're actually in game and playing it. So to do that here, we have two adjusters that we need to adjust to set up those UV scales properly. So this first one is the global UV scale, and this tells us basically how many meters are we working with where we have this terrain material applied. So this particular terrain tile that I'm working with is 1024 by 1024 meters. And so that's why I have the UV scale here set to 1024 by 1024. That brings the texture size essentially down to a 1 meter by 1 meter area. But the problem with that is that my textures, like this texture, for example, is a 3.5 meter by 3.5 meter image. So it shouldn't actually be scaled down to a 1 meter by 1 meter area. So to account for that, when you put in your texture sizes here for your UV scale, you're just going to do the 1 meter divided by the actual size in meters of that texture, so minus 3.5. And that gives you the 0.2857143. And that is the correct UV scale for this particular texture when you've set up your global UV scale to be a 1 meter by 1 meter square. And that's all I had for you today. If you'd like to take a look at Survival Ascension, you can visit us on Facebook at facebook.com/survivalascension, or you can visit gablegames.com. Thanks.